Good morning and welcome to the R15 New Obligation and Implementation Timescales webinar. My name is Amy Lawpable. I work on the communications team for the Rec Code Manager, and I will be facilitating today's session. And I have joining me today Harriet Truss, who you've just heard from, and she is the change analyst on the Rec Change team. So just to take you through a couple of bits of housekeeping for today, this session is already being recorded, and the recording and slides for this event will be made available on the Rec portal later this week. If everyone could please keep their microphones and cameras off unless speaking, it would be greatly appreciated, just so that we don't get any background disturbance. So to take your questions today, we are using Slido, and you can access this via the QR code that's currently on the screen. If you have a smartphone, you can scan this QR code to access Slido, or you can type the number on screen into Slido on your web browser. Alternatively, if you're using the desktop app for Teams, you will see an S at the top of this call where you can click and also access Slido that way. We will have a designated Q&A section, but please feel free to raise your questions through Slido as they come to you throughout the session. And just to note, I've also set up a feedback survey on Slido, so please feel free to let us know how you found today's session or give us any suggestions for how we run future events. This will come up at the end of the session. So I will now pass over to Harriet to take us through the agenda for today. Thank you, Harriet.
Hi everyone, I'll just bob on camera so you can put a face to a name to start with. I'm Harriet Truss. I work in the change team and here at the Rec Code Manager, and I've been the lead analyst on R15. And I'll take you through the agenda and the conversation today. I'll just pop back off camera so that we're focused on the slides. So the first part of the session, I'm just going to run through some of the background, some of the context for where we've got to today, before looking at a draft proposed timeline and a kind of a structured set of questions. If there are any questions along the way, as Amy says, please feel free to raise those on Slido or raise your hand on the call in the kind of normal team structure. Either way works fine. And then where one of those questions may be part of that kind of more structured section, I might kind of put you off to that section unless it, but as I say, feel free to raise your hand as and when, but I will take you through some of that information first before having the discussion time. We'll then have a quick look at kind of what the next steps are, and as Amy says, we'll have, if there's any further Q&As at the end, we'll pick those up then. Next slide please, Amy. Okay, so the focus of today's session is to gather input from the impacted stakeholders of R15 on the draft proposed timeline. We are coming out for consultation next Friday on the revised timeline, and this is part of the kind of pre-work for that, and to make sure that we've got that kind of your initial feed in to help structure that. We're not using this session to kind of fully revisit the change proposal as a whole. It is very much about the timeline, and there's a little bit more to say on that on the next slide. So one of the next slides. So if we just move on to the next slide, Amy, that'd be great. So in terms of R15 and the story so far, R15 was raised a little while back and was a self-governance change proposal, and this was to introduce the installed and working remote communications for electricity advanced meters, and the solution that was for a new obligation within the meter operation schedule for the metering equipment managers. That was rejected at the metering expert panel on the 10th of August, and we subsequently referred that to the authority at the back end of August. On the 1st of December, the Ofgem decision was to send the change proposal back. It did shift the change proposal to an authority determined change path, and with a focus to look at a revised timeline. The timelines for R15 have passed compared to the original proposal, so do need to be kind of reset, but also from the information we had previously, there wasn't enough there for Ofgem to make a clear decision themselves in their decision on that referral. So have asked us to look into that and provide that new implementation obligation timescale before sending back to them by the end of February this year, so in kind of 6 or 7 weeks time. So the context of the direction for looking at that timescale is very much within taking into consideration the P432, which is currently with the authority, and that's been through a send-back process itself, and that was resubmitted to the authority on the 16th of November, and has revised set of implementing its own revised implementation obligation timetable, and we're very much kind of considering that in our new proposal, and then also just more broadly with the MHHS migrations as a whole, and obviously there's the replan going on for MHHS at the moment, which has a kind of also a revised set of kind of migration dates in there as well that we're taking into consideration. So the next slide, please, Amy. So in terms of the high level tiling requirements, as I say, there's the P432. Obviously, we've had R15, some of the consultation and impact assessment previously before. I'm going to take you through a bit of the context of that in slightly more detail before kind of going into the high level requirements itself. Amy, if you go on to the next slide. So from P432 point of view, the implementation date that this is not approved at this stage, as I said, it's with Ofgem at the moment, but the implementation date proposed there is for the 29th of June this year, as long as that is approved by the end of March, I think it's 29th of March this year, or if it's not approved by that time, 3 months following the Ofgem decision itself. P432, the key thing that relates to R15 was around the obligations for half-hourly settlement of the current transformers, transformer advanced meters, and that the new date for that is actually by milestone 14 of the MHHS programme, and M14 is the point at which all suppliers must be able to accept MPANs in the new operating model for half-hourly settlement, market-wide half-hourly settlement. P432 is a little bit wider than that, but that's the kind of the key element for R15. If you go on to the next slide. So just for those who may not be as close to the market-wide half-hourly settlement programme and the replan, the kind of the key dates that we're interested in terms of these proposals is that the M11 and M11 particularly, but also the M12 migration dates, which is the start of migration for advanced meters, milestone 11, and that's in early April 2025. And as I mentioned, M14, to which P432 is tied, is in March 2026. And if you go on to the next slide. I just wanted to recap a little bit on the input that we've had from some of you before into the impact assessments and the consultations, and that was the kind of messages that came through there were that the CT meter obligation dates, and that's for, I mean, in P432 as well as R15, those were not supported. They were kind of much more near time than we're looking at now. Also, from a timing perspective, there was a clear message that you wanted that to be more closely tied to the MHHS timelines. In terms of when the obligation is coming into force, there was kind of, as I say, a clear message that a sufficient time is needed for parties to be able to complete the activities required to to be able to meet the obligation. And those kind of activities were relating to site visits, potential change of metering, potential change of agent, and potential contract negotiations, particularly with comms providers, SIM providers, where those remote communications, the resolution path is, kind of needs any of those activities, and as well as being able to have your portfolios understood and plans in place. The suggested lead times that we had from you were kind of anything from the 3 months, which was essentially the in support of the obligation dates as they were, and as far out as 18 months. So moving on to the next slide, Amy. So bearing in mind though the kind of context there that I've just been through, the kind of the high level requirements for the R15 timeline. The first one there, support and enhance the license condition for advanced meters, that is a key requirement of the change proposal originally, and still stands. To meet the CCGG recommendation principle that the remote communications are in place and working prior to the CT change of measurement class migration, and to de-risk the MHHS migration. Now, with the shift in the P432 dates, the CT change of measurement class migration, and also kind of the way that P432 is has been approached, is that it provides that optionality of whether the change of measurement class path is taken, or whether it's a direct migration over to the MHHS new operating model. So that kind of ties those two kind of more together than previously. Obviously, kind of recapping on what the feedback was before, that parties need appropriate time, and as with any change proposal, we want to make sure that people are able to be able to have time to meet the obligations and get their plans and systems or anything in place. So that's obviously a key requirement there. What we have done with that shift in the P432 CT obligation timescales is that there's no longer a requirement for the obligation to be split under R15. So previously we had a date for the CT meters, which was much earlier than the whole current meters. And we're looking at that just becoming a one obligation date, and I'll kind of go into that on the next slide. And then we're also kind of given the feedback, and also the closer proximity to the MHHS planning, is for parties to be able to, if they so wish, to be able to coordinate the activities that and plan across the R15, P432 and MHHS activities that are required, so that the focus for MHHS implementation is still there, but we can still achieve that, removing the barriers for any issues where there's remote communications kind of getting in the way of those migrations and the success of the MHHS programme. Next slide, please, Amy. Brilliant. So just quickly before I go into the draft proposed timeline, does anyone have any questions or anything at this point? Points of clarification?
We haven't had anything come through Slido just yet, but I'm not sure if anyone in the room has questions.
Looking like it. Okay, that's brilliant. That's great. So if we bob on to the next slide. It's quite a busy slide, but I did want to make sure that the key elements were all on this slide, as this is essentially the proposal that we're looking to. So the from an implementation date point of view, focus on that first. We're looking at aligning to P432 with the June implementation date. Again, if the authority approval is received by the end of March, and after that, if the kind of next standard release after approval, as long as that gives at least a 3-month lead time. That does differ slightly from P432 in that we would tie it to a standard release, whereas I believe P432 will be that more exact 3-month lead time from the approval point. From a rec point of view, it's there isn't the extra drive to take it out of a standard release and have that extra effort, etc. There, so it will be the next standard release, tying those in together. In terms of the obligation itself, the wording of the obligation has not shifted from the original proposal. I have kind of put that in there. I don't know whether you'll want to zoom in a little bit on your own screens just to double check it, but that's we've taken the wording kind of exactly from that, but reduced that, the A and the B, the split, and then the obligation date itself is from no later than the 1st of April 2025. That is based on the start of migration, that M11 date. As I said, that the driver for migration, the remote communications obligation, and all of those being in place ahead of the overall migrations and ahead of the kind of that optionality point of the CT advanced meter migrations, kind of giving that lead time before the overall migration requirements are there. So I'll just leave that on screen for a moment, just for people to absorb, because obviously it's the first time you'll have seen that new version. And I'll take you through a set of structured questions. Okay, so Amy, thank you. So over to you guys to a large extent. So the first question, and if you just click it twice, Amy, actually there's just has that subpoint on it. Lovely, thank you. So the first question is, do you agree with the principle that the R15 implementation date should be aligned to that of P432 as much as possible? So that's the June date with that, essentially that 3-month link. Noting that obviously the 1st of April date is much further out. Any comments? General agreement? General disagreement? Thumbs up if you want to do it that way.
We've had a comment come through Slido that says, could you have the date as M11 rather than fixed date of the 1st of the 4th, 2025? That way, if M11 moves, so does the date.
Yeah, to a certain degree, we've looked at a specific date, because the lead times, and there are questions on the lead times obviously after this, but that assuming that the lead times are appropriate and given that time, there is still there is the value in itself of R15 of the obligation going in at that time anyway. But if that I don't know if anyone wants to follow up on that in terms of the look at that, the stronger case for that, not stronger, like the case for that, or whether there's others agree that the preference would be to tie it to the MHHS date, like milestone, sorry. Does that make sense? So you give me a thumbs up in terms of that's the kind of fixed date and not having to move it, and that the R15 obligation in itself is landed.
I think for this section, if anyone wants to provide any further detail or comments to these questions, please feel free to raise your hand on Teams and or unmute yourself and speak.
And again, and in general today, if there was any comments that you want to feed through afterwards, absolutely. Anything by the end of the week can be taken into consideration in advance. Helen, you've raised your hand.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was my question.
Okay.
So I agree with this question here, the principle that yes, I think R15 should align to 432 because I think that's the main driver for it. But yeah, it was my question that if 432 moves because MHHS deadlines have moved, then surely the driver for this moves as well. which was why I suggested maybe aligning it to M11 rather than the fixed date.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, this is 15 things. Okay. Okay, we'll take that into consideration. Thank you. Lovely. Okay, if there's nothing further on that question, then Amy, if we flick on to the next one. Is there any reason that you couldn't support a 3-month lead time from approval to implementation, given that the obligation date is kind of much further in the future? If I rephrase that slightly, if you want to go for the thumbs up, thumbs down version, is there, do you support is 3-month lead time enough, essentially?
Hi, it's Robert Smith.
Hi.
I suppose the question I would have is that there's going to have to be some sort of conversations with our third-party meter operators who deal with all this stuff. That may take more than 3 months if they're supporting other suppliers.
So so in terms of the implementation dates would be the June dates.
Yeah.
Or so it's following that approval to implementation. So is there anything that those conversations need to happen before the implementation, or as part of is it the next step of understanding the portfolio, what the type of activities are?
I think the concern is that they will have conversations with a variety of different suppliers and they will have to look through the resources that they have and what they can do along with all the mandate requirements that we have for them.
Okay. Okay, any other concerns?
You've had a couple of things come through Slido. So the first one, does implementation date just mean the updated wording getting into the code rather than needing to have completed the work, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. So sorry, that's what I was trying to allude to in the question to Robert, is that the implementation date is that the date that the wording goes live in the code, essentially, and essentially confirms the obligation date itself for the 1st of April, and that's the date that you'd be working towards, or if it was tied to M11.
Thanks, Harriet. And then the second comment, it depends what actions need to happen to make sure that we are ready. If we need site visits and contract changes, this would take longer than 3 months.
Okay, so the intention isn't that kind of all plans and portfolios need to be understood at that point. There isn't essentially anything that the code manager would be seeking at that point, but it's putting in place any plans to make sure that is possible, that that portfolios are understood, past a resolution can be planned in time to meet the obligation itself. Chris?
Yeah, I think if my question's similar to those, is it worth putting up the timelines again? Because
yep.
I think I'm confused with what we mean by implementation, because I'm thinking of it as a supplier. I'm thinking, right, I need to have remote comms set up for all of these meters 3 months after it's agreed by the authority. But actually, that's just getting the wording in the rec schedules. and then we've got until 2025 to do all the work and have the data. But it's probably worth putting that into a summary timeline so it's clear for everyone to actually understand what dates align. Because obviously from new connections perspective, is that going to be the same time, so 2025, or is that going to be earlier to make sure that they're ready? Because obviously reading P432, it is slightly different dates. So I just want us to be clear about actually the timeline. So if we said, well, it's the 1st of June this year, or 3 months thereon, we update the legal text and everybody's clear on that. And then we've actually got what would effectively be 2 years to do the work, agree contract changes, manage portfolio, which actually, you know, shouldn't really be that much of a problem. There will always be nuances, but we can discuss those in probably a separate session.
Yeah. So essentially, you've summarised the timeline for me brilliantly there. Yeah, the June date would be, or the implementation date would be the text in the code. The lead time to that implementation date is the 3 months after the authority approval. The time by which the remote obligations the remote communications need to be in place would be the obligation date within that legal text. So that what was there is the 1st of April. What I will make sure that we do for the consultation papers absolutely is that timeline's kind of clearly kind of laid out, visualized, so that can easily be done in terms of dropping it straight into the slide here. Doesn't work so well, but yeah, just to clarify, implementation date is June. That's about the legal text. Obligation date, we're talking about 1st of April 2025 in what we've put forward there, and that's the time by which those need to be in place. In terms of new connections or existing, we're not distinguishing between the two. If there's if the electricity advance meter out there, that it should have remote communications, or a plan to have remote communications in place by the obligation date, notwithstanding the fact that the license obligation is already there. That these advanced meters should have communications equipment on there, and the assumption is, and that this obligation is to kind of enforce and support that, enhance and support that those they should be, remote communications is there in a working way. Eric.
I think I'm going to end up just actually endorsing the question that Chris has asked, and for background, that what you've just described is part of the reason that the metering expert panel sort of stumbled at its approval stage, because we just couldn't quite unravel what the obligation was versus what the implementation date is. So I think if you can add clarity on what implementation actually means, which is it's just a code change for a future obligation, I think that will help sort of calm people that were nervous about this being an unreasonably short lead time in practice. As Chris has just said, it's effectively it's 2 years, which is plenty of time for people to sort themselves out and get the arrangements in place.
Yeah. Lovely, thanks, Eric. Ian.
Yeah, just on referring to pick comms, just to reiterate, it's 4 reasonable steps that have been taken, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. It was a bit muffled.
So in terms of the application to pick comms, it's 4 reasonable steps have been taken to do so.
Yes, all reasonable steps. So yeah, exactly. That's the same as the proposal was previously. Yeah, all reasonable steps is in there. Lovely.
I think to pick up on that though, Ian, and I don't know whether, is there a definition of what all reasonable steps is to be agreed? Because there's always that level of understanding that one supplier or one mem may do slightly more than another, and then the other is then called in because they've not done. So unless we've got a clear definition of what all reasonable steps is, we may come up with a solution that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, so the all reasonable steps is not something that we're looking to define. That's a way of working that is kind of is used kind of across the industry, and has been proven to be the right way to do it. But Colette, I will let you
jump in here. Yeah,
jump
thanks, Harriet. Yeah, no, I was just to come back on that. So all reasonable steps is something that is not defined and is intentionally not defined, simply because on a case-by-case basis, the all reasonable steps will differ. We had quite a debate about this during the development of the CP Plus. I mean, we looked at the range of spectrum of obligations, and we felt that all reasonable steps is sufficiently clear and, as I say, is on a case-by-case basis. So we could turn around and give you an example of what would be reasonable for one meter site, but wouldn't necessarily be all reasonable for another. It's too I forget the right word here, sorry. At the end of the day, it's literally site-by-site basis, and ultimately it will be down to you to justify that you've taken all those reasonable, you have taken all reasonable steps to install comms on those sites. If the matter comes up, you know, for a debate with maybe the PAB or whatever other assurance maybe under the BSC that there might be, but as I say, it's deliberately not defined, and legally it is something that is dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thanks, Colette.
Right, so apologies for, I guess, labouring this point, but who is responsible for that? Is it the MEM because this is on them, or is it the supplier because they're appointing the MEM? So who would the authority?
The obligation applies to the MEM for them to take all reasonable steps to install remote working communications. That is obviously backed up between the supplier and the MEM in their contracts. But under the REC, it's the MEM that is accountable for that.
Right, thank you.
Ian?
Yeah, do you have a view on what would happen to those sites where all these steps have been carried out but have been unsuccessful? What happened to those sites in terms of children and children?
Sorry, Ian, it's quite muffled on your line. Can you say that again?
And I was just wondering what would happen to sites that failed to have comms installed. So all these steps have been taken and what would happen?
So what would happen for sites where remote communications, you haven't been able to put those in place?
Yeah.
For whatever reason. So
yeah.
I think the all reasonable steps approach is, it does recognise that there are sites where they won't be possible, and that a small subset where there is nowhere to go on that, but for ones where there is a resolution path, if there isn't a and that hasn't been achieved, but that might move, for example. So if it's to do with a technology or availability or anything like that, that is so where Colette had mentioned a kind of case by case, meter by meter, that's also at a given point in time. So if they're because it has been discussed previously about the availability of specific equipment and technologies, that will move on. So it might be at one point in time that can't be, but if it's this could be in the future should something else move on, then that would still, as long as that's still being followed and kind of revisited, then that would be the approach to take. In terms of what would happen, there as part of R15, there's no performance assurance measures being put in place at this time, so there isn't anything kind of specific against that we can point to at the moment.
I think it's also fair to say that although there's no current plans for performance assurance risk to be measuring this now, if it's felt that suppliers the members don't take the action to make sure that the comms are being put in place, that it may well be that the Performance Assurance Board will revisit that decision, and it will then be down to the member to demonstrate exactly what steps have been taken or why it is that comms can't be put in place. So I think, as Harriet says, at the moment there may not be a requirement for you to make that case today. It may well be that does change as we get closer to implementation of half-hourly settlement, and if a large swathe of these meters remain non-communicating, then it will cause a problem and there'll be a requirement to do something about it. I think the other thing is, not wanting to sort of close down the conversation completely, but I think the purpose of the call today is possibly not really to start reopening the debate about all reasonable endeavours. It's really to try and help focus on resolving timeline issues. So if we possibly can try and keep to the subject in hand, that would really help.
Well, thanks, Colette. And yeah, Ian, if you want to have a conversation kind of after this, then we can follow that up, but and we can make sure that revisit the reports and everything, and make sure we're clear on how that because the rest of the change proposal obviously is going to still be there to be viewed. So if we move on to the next question, Amy. Are there any concerns about the obligation date no longer being split across current transformer and whole current meters? So this is where it's the one obligation date all set to 1st of April 2025, but focusing on the joining up, not the date there. If I just flip that over and ask for thumbs up, are there any sorry, get this the right way around. Are people happy that there's no longer a split and that it's one obligation date? One thumbs up. Any more? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. And any of these, any dissenters, please, shout up. Lovely. Okay, and next question. Does anyone disagree with the intention for the remote communications under all reasonable principles to be in place at the latest before the MHHS migration starts, which is also when the optionality becomes available for the CT meter move to half-hourly? I will flip that round, seeing as thumbs up seems to be working. So do you agree with that intention? Lovely. Thanks, everyone. Right. And one more, lovely. Next question, please, Amy. Does the obligation date of the 1st of April 2025 raise any concerns for being able to complete required activities as we've been discussing, and notwithstanding all reasonable steps in meeting the obligation? And are there any other kind of lead time requirements that we haven't kind of mentioned already that, understand the portfolio, site visits, change of metering? Is there anything that I haven't clocked that we need to? That's the third. So slightly changing that question, and oh, Chris, go on before I do that.
Yeah, so I mean, is this to make sure that every site that is on each portfolio has remote working comms outside of all reasonable steps?
Yeah, by 1st of April, that would be the intention.
And if not, and if we don't, then here's the reasons why.
Yeah, exactly.
Fine. No, that makes sense.
Yep. So just a kind of a show of thumbs, are people supportive of that 1st of April date, notwithstanding the that we'll have a look at that M11, whether it's the M11 or the April specific date. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Amy, is there another question or is it the next slide? Ah. Have to ask the question, is there any appetite for the obligation date to be any sooner? Does anyone definitely think it should be sooner? If everyone else promises not to shoot them down. No, no one's going to volunteer that one. Have to ask the question though. Okay then.
I think you then generally end up getting a lot of pushback saying no, it needs to stay that date due to all the issues you're going to have with trying to resource this and get things ready.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Okay. Next slide. Next steps. So in terms of next steps, obviously we've had really good input today, and we'll be pulling together the report and the consultation for next week. And as I say, that will go out on the 20th, Friday the 20th, and you'll see that through our normal communication channels. The consultation timescales are 10 working days this time around. Normally we'd do a 5 working day, but given the kind of timescales that we've got, but also that this isn't kind of entirely new news for the CP itself, there's a 10 working day turnaround for that, so the closing date is the 3rd of February. Then that will go to the rate change panel on, I think it's the 20th of February, and we'll get that recommendation over to the authority by the end of the month. Next slide, Amy. So just a last opportunity for anyone's questions on any of the above, or any of the kind of the process or the next steps.
So we've not had anything come through Slido just yet, but just a reminder to anyone who may have forgotten, you can join Slido by scanning the QR code that's on screen, or by typing the number on screen into slido.com on your web browser.
Okay. No one wants to raise a hand? Oh.
Sorry,
yeah, go on.
if we go back right to the beginning, obviously the authority have pushed this back. What was the determining reason for them to do that? Was it the timeline, or was it that the meter and expert panel said no? Is it cost? Is it, is there something that we need to really understand as well that will help support this?
Yeah, so the direction was very much to provide the timelines. It was about the timelines. So one, it was to kind of move the CP back into a space where we'd be working on it again, with the direct kind of focus on those timelines, and how that fits, in the context of P432 and MHHS migration. So as R15 as an obligation itself, and there was no kind of request or direction in there about revisiting the case for the obligation itself. It was very much about the timelines.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, no other questions. Anne, I'm going to give you the opportunity to, if there's anything else from a change process or overall point of view that you wanted to add, or.
No, thanks, Harry. I think it's useful to talk it through and understand the position. I think making sure we're clarifying the difference between implementation into the code and obviously when the obligation bites and the activity needs to be completed. I think we'll make sure that's really clear. I think picking up on I suppose the send back from Ofgem, the obligation that was originally the dates that we set out originally in R15, just to be clear, we timed out. So the implementation date for getting into the code, we wouldn't have been able to make that if Ofgem had made a decision at that point. So I think that was the real driver for them being able to send it back and for us to then reconsider what those dates are. But obviously with the activity on 432 and the programme kind of shifting and replan activity, it was the ideal time to almost look at it in the wider context as well. And it gives us that opportunity to, you know, Harry, as you've explained, there's no reason now to split out whole current and CT meters, so we're going to join those together. But I'm hoping that everyone's found this a useful session to clarify those points, and from our perspective, it is really useful to get people's input on kind of what the challenges are, and actually the timeframes that we're now proposing. You know, we're taking it as feel as workable. Thinking about that 1st of April kind of implementation date. So hopefully everyone's found that useful to talk it through, and thanks Harriet for taking us through.
Lovely, thanks Anne. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. Obviously we do encourage you to respond to the consultation when it comes out. As I say, if anybody does want to drop anything through to the change mailbox, change.management, kind of by the end of this week, we can take that into consideration kind of prior to the materials being produced, but otherwise, yeah, the consultation period is there, and yeah, and if anyone you know wants to pick up on any specific points, then yeah, communication lines are open. So yeah, thanks everybody. Amy, I'll just hand back over to you to close out.
Thanks, Harriet. So yeah, just a final reminder from me, we've set up a Slido survey, so you can submit any feedback that you may have for us. So feel free to give us any comments on how you feel today's session went, or give us any kind of feedback for future events that we may hold. So yeah, thank you again for attending, and I hope you all have a good day.